For those, I think we're back on. I think they've interrupted. I think they've interrupted my broadcast. They're probably getting as sophisticated as the FBI in radio transmission. But we'll forge ahead. For those caught in its web, caught in the web of an organized crime structure, they really have no rights. If you consider the plight of the legitimate businessman who is being extorted by organized crime, or the person who maybe has gambled too much or borrowed too much and is caught in their web, they might as well be living in a totalitarian state, because their rights and their life and their future will be decided by arbitrary means. And as you review our history over the last 100 years, as these organizations grew from street-level gangs to middle-level organizations to national and international cartels that have invaded labor unions, legitimate businesses, to some extent politics and our social structure, you wonder, how did it all happen? How did we let this happen? And how could we permit this kind of quasi-illegitimate government to operate in many of our cities and across our country over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years? Well, let me see if I can briefly analyze for you the history of how organized crime developed in the United States, and then let's see what lessons we can learn from that so that we don't let this continue to happen to us in the future. Because the very history of organized crime, traditional organized crime, that now exists in the United States is an ongoing history. It is happening with immigrant populations, and it is happening on a lower scale and at a street-level scale today, just been 180 and 90 years ago. I find it very helpful in describing the history of organized crime and then figuring out what to do about it, to really look at it from the point of view of how it progressed and how we permitted it to progress. At the turn of the century, there were many different organized crime groups in this country, and they were operating basically at what I call the street level, the way street gangs operate. They were involved in extorting money from legitimate small businessmen, usually small businessmen of their same immigrant group as their group, who didn't understand, or maybe the reality was that you could not turn to law enforcement for help. They were, in essence, the governing body in that community. And they were engaged in protection, the protection business, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, and even in those days, street-level drug transactions. You all, I'm sure, have heard of Charles Lucky Luciano. He was a very famous leader of an organized crime family in New York in the 1920s and 30s, who finally was sent to prison and then was released from prison and sent to Sicily to help the Allies during the war effort. There's always been a question about whether traditional organized crime was involved in drug trafficking. It's interesting to note that Charles Lucky Luciano began his career as a criminal selling heroin in 1922 and 1923, when he was involved in a street-level gang. So they've been involved in drugs from the very beginning, at the street level. It was in the 1920s and the 1930s, during Prohibition, that these street-level gangs developed into much stronger corporate structures. They gained a great deal of capital, they gained money, they organized themselves nationally and internationally for the purpose of bringing liquor illegally into this country. And though that organizational structure was there to be exploited even after Prohibition was a thing of the past. And it really is at that point that they began to move from that second level, which were, if we were to compare it to legitimate businesses, fairly active, well-capitalized corporations. It was at that stage that they developed into really an international cartel. Numerous families all throughout the United States, connections overseas, and moving out from those core businesses, extortion, loan sharking, drugs, to beginning to infiltrate unions, legitimate businesses, entire industries, becoming involved in politics, becoming involved in our social structures. The goal for law enforcement from then until now, and unfortunately it's only now that it really is being achieved as effectively as it should be achieved, is to drive that organization back from the international and national cartel that it's become to the middle level that it used to be at, back to the street gang at which it started. And at the same time, law enforcement has the goal of making certain that other groups don't move in the opposite direction, don't move up from the street level to the middle level to the international cartel that was and continues to be the mafia. Those are the two things that law enforcement has to achieve. No matter what I do, no matter what the entire Department of Justice does, no matter what the FBI does, no matter what any local police department does, no matter how effective we are, if we were 10 times, 20 times more effective than we are today, after we finish doing whatever magic we could do, and we can't do magic, there would still be crime. There would still be people who murder each other. There would still be people who steal from each other. There would still be people who victimize each other. It has always been such in human history, and there's nothing that law enforcement can do to change that. We can reduce and have under greater control all of that behavior that I described, but we're never going to eliminate it. But we don't have to have, and we don't have to tolerate organized crime. We do not have to tolerate a governing structure operating in our cities and in our rural areas and throughout this country that operates as its own government. That is not inherent in human nature. It is not something that we have to accept. And the only reason it does exist, and the only reason it flourished for as long as it did, was because we did accept it. In the last 5 or 7 years, there has been a great deal more success in dealing with the mafia as an organized crime group and the 20 or 25 other newly emerging and somewhat emerged organized crime groups than has ever been the case before. And there are some very good reasons for that, and I think it's helpful to locate a few of those, to expand on them, and then to look at some of the things that we're not doing that we should be doing. What are we doing right? What is it that has been done in the last 4 or 5 years that wasn't done before that has resulted in numerous prosecutions of mafia organized crime figures and other organized crime groups and the figures in those groups? First of all, starting about 7 or 8 years ago, we began to make it a national priority to deal with the problem of organized crime. And under the leadership of President Reagan, under the leadership of Attorney General Smith and now Attorney General Meese, and under the leadership of Director Webster of the FBI and the United States Department of Justice has devoted enormous resources to investigating and prosecuting the traditional organized crime groups and the newly emerging organized crime groups on a scale that has never been done before. And without that kind of national attention to the problem, you're just not going to deal with these kinds of structures that have national power and international power. And what else has been done? What flowed from that? What flowed from that was a tremendous amount of cooperation, for example, with the Italian government. We have prosecuted numerous organized crime figures in the United States successfully and sent them off to prison. The Italian government has prosecuted even more, and even more quickly, even more expeditiously, and sent them to prison even more quickly. All of that is very, very important, because no matter how much success we have in the United States dealing with the problem of organized crime, if it continues as a major problem internationally, there are going to be people they can go to and resources they can call upon that will help them to revive themselves. The fact that both the United States and Italy at the same time are dealing with this problem jointly gives us some real hope that we can reduce it and eliminate it. And it also has become the basis for a great deal more cooperation between the two governments, because they got together 4 or 5 years ago to begin dealing realistically with the problem of organized crime. In my office, there are often as many as 10 or 15 Italian judges and prosecutors working with us on the cases that we're developing, giving us help, giving us evidence, and we're giving them the same thing. It's the kind of cooperation that gives you real hope that you can end the problem. And it's the kind of cooperation that can only take place where there's national attention given to it. This can't be done by a local police officer or a local authority trying to deal with it, because it involves really the exercise of foreign policy. In recent years, the glare of publicity has been focused on organized crime in a way that has never been focused before, and that is very, very important. It's not as important as prosecuting them and putting them in prison and taking their assets away, but it's almost as important. And it's important because power is often derived from their being secret, from their being able to operate unknown, undetected. It is essentially, on a larger scale, the way, in fact, a bully almost always operates. A bully operates secretly. When you turn your attention to the person and identify the person for what he is, you identify the organization for what it is, you can often begin the process of ending it. And that is, in fact, what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. It is very, very important to also not be afraid to identify these organizations by name, by their actual name, not to make believe that they're something else. And we went through a whole history of making believe that the mafia was some other organization than what it actually was. And we did that because of the fact that there was a great deal of political pressure brought to bear to not use the word mafia, to not mention it, to not say it. And I think that was, in fact, a very, very harmful thing that was done on the part of people in public office and on the part of people in law enforcement. And I'll tell you why it was. And I've talked to people who have been in the middle of this kind of situation. If you, day in and day out, are paying extortion money as a businessman, let's say in the garment industry in New York, which happens to be an area that is particularly afflicted by this, and you are paying it to a mafia family that you've known about and your father has known about for 50 or 100 years, and you hear a public official stand up and say, I'm not going to say the word mafia, there is no such organization, it doesn't exist, you can't use the word mafia. All of a sudden, that organization takes on a kind of significance and power that is just overwhelming. I mean, here, you know it exists, you know it extorts money from you, you know that it's been shaking you down for 50 or 100 years, and law enforcement authorities can't utter the word. That looks to you like a pretty powerful organization. And in saying the word and in talking realistically, you begin to give hope to people that, in fact, government really does want to do something meaningful and effective about organized crime. That's a very important lesson to learn, because many of these newly emerging organized crime groups also organize themselves ethnically. They organize themselves around the fact that everyone is Hispanic, or everyone is Oriental, or everyone is black, or everyone is something else. And if we can't say that to each other and talk realistically about it, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. What we have to understand is that we shouldn't be so darn defensive about the fact that in every ethnic group, in every racial group, there are a certain number of people who commit crimes. Some of them are organized criminals. It is true of every single race. It is true of every single ethnic group. We should not identify ourselves with the worst among us. Italians should not be sensitive about the fact that a certain number of Italians are in the mafia, any more than any other racial or ethnic group should be concerned about the fact that a certain percentage of their group commit serious crimes, do terrible things, do awful things, and they shouldn't define themselves by that little small percentage. Instead, they should define themselves by the majority and the overwhelming numbers who are decent, law-abiding citizens. And as an Italian American, I've never had any problem with that. And I think we can teach a lesson, Italian Americans can teach a lesson to other groups that are going to have to deal with that problem in the future. Another very, very important aspect of why we've had success now, over and above the success that we've had in the past, is the use of what is known as electronic surveillance, court-authorized electronic surveillance. In the old days, in the 20s and in the 30s, it was very, very difficult to get people to testify in organized crime cases, in drug cases, for obvious reasons, because their life was at risk if they did so. Nowadays, When we get information from well-placed informants, when the FBI or the Drug Enforcement Administration or the police develop information from well-placed informants who are afraid to testify, we can often utilize their information to go to court and ask a judge to give us authorization to wiretap or to surveil electronically. So in essence, in the long run, what we get as evidence is the tape-recorded conversation of the organized crime figure, and you don't have to put the life of the witness in jeopardy. A couple of days ago, when United States District Judge Owen was handing out 100-year sentences to the leaders of organized crime in New York, to the heads of 3 of the families and their chief lieutenants, one of them arrogantly got up, yelling and screaming at the judge, saying to him, "How could you have accepted the word of all of those liars and terrible people who testified against me?" And the judge looked at him and said, "You were convicted based on your own words that the FBI was able to obtain on tape. You were the one who explained that you were a member of the mafia, that you extorted people, that you ordered murders. It was your words. Remember the 500 hours of tape recordings in your car." And he just sat down, totally stunned by what the judge had said to him, because among other things, he had made a total fool out of himself by the things that he had said on tape. There really was no witness for him to kill, no witness for him to intimidate, no witness for him to frighten, because the only and the major witness against him was himself. That is the value of court-authorized electronic surveillance, of being able to bug and being able to wiretap. All of that has to be done very carefully. All of it has to be approved by a judge. All of it is reviewed by appellate courts. It should not be done on a wide scale, and it shouldn't be done in my own discretion as a prosecutor or anyone else's. But by the same token, if there's any hope of breaking up these major organized crime and drug groups, it has to be done. It's something that we have to do under controlled circumstances, and it is enormously valuable. And so is the racketeering statute. The racketeering statute makes it possible for us to prosecute these groups as organizations that are involved in racketeering enterprises. All of you, I'm sure, remember the story of Al Capone and how Al Capone was eventually convicted of tax evasion and tax fraud. And any number of organized crime figures had to be prosecuted that way in what I will call the old days. What would happen is that no matter how conscientious the judge was, the judge would have available a very limited amount of time to put a person in prison, because in fact all the judge had proven in front of him was a small amount, a minuscule amount of this person's criminal activity. The racketeering statute, if we can gather the evidence, permits the federal government to place before the jury and before the judge the reality of Al Capone, or the Al Capone of today's criminal career. Not that he's a tax evader, but that he's a murderer, that he's an extortionist, that he's a drug dealer. All of the various activities of his organized crime family can be put before the judge and the jury, both for the purposes of obtaining a conviction and then, most important, for the purpose of sentencing him. And that's why, in the particular case that I mentioned before, the judge was really empowered to give 100-year sentences, because he had proven to him beyond a reasonable doubt that these men led 60 and 70-year-long careers of murdering people and committing assorted other crimes. It's very important to be able to do that. And the second part of the racketeering statute is equally as important, and that is the ability to seize the assets of these organized crime families. One of the reasons that we haven't had success, or as much as we should have over the years, is even when you convict an Al Capone or a Lucky Luciano or a Vito Genovese or any one of these organized crime leaders, others come along and take over the multi-million-dollar empire that they leave behind and operate it the way a corporation would. If the president or the chief executive officer was removed, you just bring in another one to run it. The racketeering statute allows us to follow up a criminal conviction by taking away from that organized crime family as much of the financial enterprise as we can identify. As much of the money and the property as we can identify is connected to the illegal activity. So we can begin the process of whittling down the economic power that these organizations have achieved. And that is really, in the long run, even more important than the people who are involved in it, because it's that economic power that they utilize to increase their criminal activities. Now, what else is it that we can do that we're not doing? Well, we can utilize all the things that I've talked about and continue to do it, but there are some things that are really important to keep in mind that we probably can do a better job of. The American government, governmental structure, whether it's law enforcement or anything else, I think a fatal flaw if we look at it historically in dealing with significant social problems. And I consider organized crime and drugs to be a significant social problem. And that is where we achieve some degree of success, where we solve the problem 50% or 60% or 70%. We then declare that we have had a major victory, we've ended poverty, or we've ended organized crime, or we've ended a particular drug problem, and we then go move on to something else, and we don't follow up. If we were to do that, even though we've achieved major victories against organized crime, now, with organized crime, in 2 or 3 years, they would be back in precisely the same position that they were in before we started that effort. So it is really important to continue to do the same things and to do more of it, to keep the pressure on right now. It is important to see if we can use as a model for the states the various things that the federal government has been able to do. Almost every state should have a racketeering statute. Almost every state should have a law that permits, under court supervision, under narrow circumstances, electronic surveillance of organized criminals and corrupt politicians and corrupt businessmen. Because we need that kind of broad base of prosecutions and of law enforcement emphasis that's only possible if we have all of the states participating and not just the federal government. And we need desperately a national offensive to reduce the drug problem. We need it because of all of the problems that organized crime is involved in, the one that is really beyond the scope of law enforcement. And I think all the rest are within the scope of law enforcement. The drug problem is beyond the scope of law enforcement to solve. Law enforcement can help. It can keep its finger in the dike so things don't get worse. Maybe it can reduce the drug problem a little bit. And it can keep things from getting out of control. But it's not going to end the problem of drugs. And I think that's really for a very, very basic reason. I think the reason that we have the massive problem, the massive drug problem that we have in the United States, comes down to something that's totally unrelated to law enforcement. I think it comes down to education. Not just formal education, but education thought of in a much broader sense. I truly believe that we have educated ourselves over the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years into the drug problem that we have today. We did it in the 60s and in the 70s, and we did it with the foolish, stupid, and silly things that we said to people about drugs. We did it in the messages that we sent to people, for example, that the use of cocaine was fairly benign, that it really wasn't a very dangerous drug, that it really wasn't an addictive drug, that it was kind of cool to use drugs, that you probably were smarter and more intellectual if you used drugs than if you didn't. We sent those messages in our movies and in our music. We sent those messages in what our professors said to the young people that they were teaching, to what our actors said when they talked to magazines. We sent those messages in a million different ways for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years, and we convinced large numbers of Americans that they should invest in drug trafficking, that they should buy their $100, $200, $300, $1,000, $2,000 worth of drugs on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. And it is, in fact, the soft core investor in the drug business that makes it a runaway problem. If the drug problem were a $10 billion or $15 billion problem, law enforcement could affect it. When we make arrests in the heroin area, which is a smaller problem, we see an effect on it. We see the number of people seeking heroin coming down. We see them going to alternatives to heroin. When we make those same number of arrests in the cocaine area, we see very little effect. And that's because the cocaine problem is a $30, $40, and $50 billion problem. It's all those people who have been miseducated, who are so-called soft core users of cocaine, that it is making it an impossible problem to control. And the way out of the problem is to educate ourselves in the same way that we miseducated people about the realistic dangers of cocaine. we can educate them into understanding that what they're dealing with is a deadly substance that is stupid for them to be using. And we can do it by using the same mediums that we used to create this problem for ourselves in the first place, including our formal educational system, where we should have extremely well thought out and well put together educational efforts that deal with the problem of drugs. We should not cave into it. We should not give into it. We should not give up about it, because it is not a problem that we can't solve, but we sure as heck better do a lot about it, and on a national level, on a state level, and on a local level, if we're going to turn it around. Finally, that brings me really to what I think is the single most important observation that I can make after 4 years of being a United States attorney, and then for other periods of time being involved with the problem of crime, whether it's white-collar crime or drug crime, organized crime, or various forms of fraud. When you see so many examples of it, and when you see so many examples of it among our best educated and most advantaged people in our society, what you say to yourself is, we're just not doing a good enough job today of educating people as to fundamental values. Many, many years ago, there was a very, very vital democracy in Athens. And it probably is the model for all democracies, participatory government. And what the Athenians realized was that teaching ethics and values was, in fact, one of the most important things and one of the great protectors of a democracy. That it was a vital part of the education of a young Athenian, just as vital as teaching mathematics, just as vital as teaching writing. Because in a democracy, the values that a government will possess will be the values of its citizens. And in fact, we do not do a good job in America, in American education, of teaching values. I don't mean religious values. I don't mean partisan values. I mean the kinds of values that Aristotle and Plato wrote about. Values that can be taught in a non-sectarian way, values that can be taught to first graders and second graders and third graders. If we can take the difficult concepts of mathematics and reduce them to things that first and second and third graders can deal with, we can do the same thing with ethics, and we can do the same thing with values. The Athenians were able to do it thousands of years ago. America in the 1980s should be able to do it, and we sure better start doing it, because in fact, that is, if we're starting to deal with what are the core problems that cause crime and that make it difficult for us to deal with crime, that's one of the major ones, and it happens to be one that government can have an effect on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rudy Giuliani, for your remarks on organized crime and drug trafficking. Now, I would like to turn our program over to Dr. Walter E. Hoagley, President of the Commonwealth Club of California, who will preside over the question and answer period. Dr. Hoagley.
Thank you, Dennis Wu. We're very fortunate, indeed grateful to Mr. Giuliani for being with us today. We have, as usual, Mr. Giuliani, an enormous number of questions, some of which have come in by radio listeners and others here, and we're not probably going to be able to cover more than a fraction of them. But I think the audiences generally should know that this year we're going to highlight a certain number of subjects, and the one that's being introduced today with respect to law and society is clearly a very high one on our priority this year. Mr. Giuliani, our group is always very tender and kind in the kind of questions we ask, and first ones are pretty general, and then sometimes we get a little more specific, but you obviously have demonstrated how capable you are, so I'm sure you will these. First, how does the magnitude of organized crime operation in the United States compare with that in Western Europe, Russia, China, Japan, or elsewhere? Can you give us just a quick reaction as to, are we the worst, or next to, or just what?
I can't say that I can tell you how we compare with regard to organized crime, because I'm not sure statistics are kept on that. But I think that the levels of violent crime probably reflect how we compare in general with most of the other Western democracies. Americans murder each other 10 times more than Englishmen do and 20 times more than Japanese do. And we commit violent crimes at levels like that, and we victimize each other on that kind of proportion in comparison to, let's say, Great Britain or Italy or France or Germany or Japan, the countries with which we would like to compare ourselves. I can't tell you that means that our organized crime problem is that much greater than those countries or our white-collar crime problem, but I have a sense, at least, that it works out to about the same. I think that America has more of a problem with lawlessness and with crime. I think it romanticizes the criminal to a much greater extent than most of those other societies. But then again, we have a much more heterogeneous and many more difficult problems to deal with. So I don't know how fair the comparisons are. The bottom line conclusion should be that we have a very big crime problem that we have to deal with, probably greater than most of our allies that we'd want to compare ourselves to, and there are a lot of things that we should be doing about it.
Questioner says that you commented that the Italian government is working with us. How about cooperation from other governments, particularly South American countries, the Middle East, France?
Generally, the level of cooperation between governments is much greater on the problem of crime, and particularly on the problem of drugs, than has been the case before. And there really is a reason for that. A decade or two ago, it was very difficult to get cooperation, particularly from Europeans, with regard to the drug problem, because they saw it as an American problem. Italy had no drug problem. West Germany had no drug problem. England had little, if any, drug problem. Today, their drug problems are similar to ours. So they have begun to understand it as an international problem that they have to cooperate about, because it is in essence the same international groups that are causing the drug problems for them or exploiting the drug problems for them as for us. So you get a great deal more cooperation. When you start dealing with the countries that are the places where the drugs are originally grown, the South American countries and the Asian countries, then it's much more difficult, because you're asking them to deal with some very, very basic problems of their own, including controlling their own population, controlling to some extent the corruption that goes on within some of those governments. It's a much more difficult problem. I think we put a lot more emphasis on it and work on it a lot more than we did before, but that's not going to be an easy one to really solve.
Comments, you indicated that there was a real need to educate the American people as to the severity of the drug problem and related matters, particularly for young people. Can you tell us more what you mean by educate? What specifically should people be doing, and how do we get them to do it?
Well, there are a number of things that I think have to be done. I mentioned in my prepared remarks the whole question of formal educational programs and trying to seek out the very best ones. There are some very good ones in our primary and secondary school systems throughout the United States. There are some excellent anti-drug education programs that have worked very, very well. And there are others that haven't worked. I think it would be very important for us to locate those that have worked and try and spread them further so that other school systems could take advantage of them. But even more important than schools, it's the informal ways in which we communicate with each other that I think has a lot to do with the values that young people acquire. It is to amaze me that the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, which has taken the art of advertising and communication, political advertisement, commercial advertisement, to a point beyond which I guess it's never been taken by any society, in selling someone a candidate or a product, that whole industry and that whole area of our society doesn't get more involved in creative ways to teach young people about the dangers of drugs and to use the techniques that we use so successfully to sell products and to sell candidates, to not sell so much as to teach what is in fact the reality, that you are taking a tremendous risk with your future and with your life if you start using drugs. And I think there's hope. I think if you look at the efforts against drunk driving that have been made, both from the law enforcement point of view and the educational point of view, we have made real inroads in most states and nationally in the whole problem of drunk driving. And on a small scale, that's a good model that could be followed for drugs, a combination of stiff consequences, sentencings that really wake people up about the dangers of driving drunk or of using drugs or buying drugs, as well as educational efforts that teach people that there are very serious consequences to what you're doing, and maybe you don't want to be doing it.
The next questioner has a rather negative point of view. It says, do you agree with the estimate that more than 10% of our population really wants drugs? And if the number is anything like that, isn't it impossible to enforce prohibition as it was on alcohol? Shouldn't we legalize drugs?
I don't know what the percentage is of our society that wants drugs. I don't know if it's 10% or less than or more than. It's certainly a large percentage, but it is nowhere near the percentage of our population that wanted liquor in the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, there is no really fair comparison between the two. In fact, what we were trying to do with prohibition was something that 70 to 80% of our population wanted to do, not 5 or 10 or 15 or even 20% of our population. And there really isn't, I don't think, a fair comparison between the dangers of heroin and cocaine and the dangers of a small use of alcohol. Someone said to me that they've never met a social user of heroin, and I've never met a social user of heroin. There is no such thing. So I think we can sometimes pick a facile comparison to prohibition, and it just doesn't all work. I also don't think that people who I can understand why people quickly jump to the conclusion or even the kind of hope of legalization, because the problem is so frustrating. It's a very, very frustrating and difficult problem. And it seems like a quick fix. Legalize it, let people have all the heroin, cocaine, and marijuana they want, and then the next day we will have no problem. The problem will be all over with. Well, that you have to think that out before you jump to that conclusion, because we've done that very often in American history. We've solved the problem, thought it was gone, and then all of a sudden the problem was much worse because of the solution than it was if we had thought a little bit better and maybe not have jumped to a quick solution to the problem. You would have to have the government giving heroin addicts all the heroin that they wanted in order to reduce their necessity for committing crime. And heroin is a drug that you become, in essence, immune to. You need more of it in order to maintain the reaction that you had the first time. So you'd basically have to have a doctor prescribing or permitting a person to commit suicide, to take as much heroin as they wanted any time they wanted it. In England, they have a system where doctors try to control the amount of heroin or illegal drugs that people get. And the drug problem in England has magnified dramatically over the last 15 or 20 years of legalization because there's a tremendous black market in drugs. The addict will get whatever he can get from the doctor, and then he will go out on the black market and buy from organized crime at very, very high rates the amount of drugs that he actually wants. So you get the worst of both. You have society helping to create legitimately a larger drug problem by giving a certain amount of drugs away, and then you have organized crime dealing in the black market and making a tremendous amount of money. And I don't have a fear, I'm certain that that's what would happen to us. That the organized crime groups would actually make more money off legalization because they deal in the black market with even higher rates for the purchase of drugs. And at the same time, we would increase the number of drug users by the fact that society would now be sanctioning drug use. There are only a few ways in a democracy that you can teach people values. One of the ways you teach people values is by making something unlawful. When you change that, you begin to teach the opposite. And I have no doubt that many more people would be using drugs if we legalize drugs than is the case today. And I think we would have the opposite effect on organized crime.
There are many questioners who have commented with congratulatory tones to the fine job that you're doing in your area, Mr. Giuliani. There is, however, an under of questioning as to whether the convictions that you've had recently will not be subject to appeal, to some type of freedom some way, somehow, and that the top group somehow will not really be hit as hard as the publicity might suggest. Any reaction?
Well, every conviction is subject to appeal, and I I can't tell you what will happen on appeal. Obviously, we're always hopeful that a case is sustained on appeal. And insofar as their sentences are concerned, there is a possibility within a period of time of reducing those sentences. The judge who sentenced these defendants, I don't think has any desire or would consider reducing their sentences. And I don't think there are any, at least problems on appeal that I can think of. And many of the cases, this was the culmination of a large number. It wasn't even the culmination. It was probably the most publicized of what are a large number of prosecutions, not just in New York, but all throughout the country by the Justice Department, cases developed by the FBI. And many of those cases have been affirmed on appeal, including, I think, 4 or 5 in my own district, so that there hasn't been any kind of major problem with these cases being overturned on appeal or judges later letting them out on a lesser sentence. In the past, if you go back 8, 9, 10 years, there was a problem of the parole board sometimes letting people that were sentenced. I can think of one organized crime figure who was sentenced to 50 years in prison who was let out after 11 or 12 years, someone that we had to prosecute again. That used to happen. I think that everyone is well educated enough now as to the problems that is not going to happen in the future.
We have a number of questions involving the future of the mafia. For specific, is there a younger mafia generation that is now forming and will take over immediately? And do you expect a violent struggle before that new leadership emerges? And how will that affect your particular responsibility?
If we deal just with for a moment, sure, there are younger people that are moving up, and there are younger people that take over the positions that were vacated by older people. One of the 3 organized crime leaders that was convicted was 52 or 54 years old, which in organized crime circles, and now as I get older also to me, appears to be pretty young. And some others are in their 40s. But I think there's something that we should realize about the future of the mafia that gives me great hope, particularly as an Italian American, that this organization is really not going to be around 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. They just don't have the recruits available to them that they had available to them in 1910 and 1920 and 1930 because of the demographics. The Italian American community has changed. The people that they might have gone to in the 1910s and 20s and 30s to fill in the ranks are now in college, law school, medical school in record numbers. And I think the demographics of the Italian American community have changed so much that we're fighting an enemy that cannot replace itself the way it has to, given the amount of pressure that we're putting on them. And what I think we have to look at for the future, and this is not to say that we should take any pressure off the mafia, is which one of the other groups, of which there are 20 or so others, is likely to replace them. Because in New York, I can tell you that there are areas in which the mafia now is receding in power, and other groups are moving in. It's kind of like a vacuum being created. And I think the thing that we have to think about and plan for is to deal with those groups at an early stage, and also to start identifying which ones seem to be trying to move into legitimate parts of our society, starting to move into legitimate businesses and labor unions, and trying to gain grab the institutional kind of power that the mafia used to have almost exclusively. And that's where I think, in terms of looking at younger people, where we have to have the most concern.
What more can you tell us about the incidence of organized crime across the United States? Which major cities, and for many of us in this area, how about the Bay Area or California?
Well, it's the organized crime picture in the United States changes wherever you're located in different parts of the country. And the traditional mafia families really were much more of a problem in the older northeastern cities, midwestern cities. The picture on the West Coast is a more complex one. A lot of the newly emerging groups that's almost, I hate to say that, but that's kind of a way to describe it, because they're not really new and they're not emerging. They've been there for a while and they have emerged, but we call them newly emerging groups to distinguish them from the mafia. Those are the groups that have much more of an effect on most of the cities on the West Coast, with a certain amount of mafia presence and influence in some of the cities. And in some ways, it's a more complicated picture for law enforcement because those groups are not groups that we've had a 20-year history of infiltrating and gathering intelligence about. That's the downside of it. The upside of it is that none of those groups have the traditional structure and the very, very tight controls that the mafia, at least in the past, used to be able to exercise, and it is a little bit easier to get cooperation and information about them than at least used to be the case about the mafia.
We have a question here which in effect says, are you getting enough money to do your job? And then right with it is the question, how will the Reagan administration's new budget cuts affect you and your program in drug enforcement?
No one ever gets enough money to do anything. You'd be a fool to say that you get enough money to carry out all the things that you want to do. In fact, the history with law enforcement on the federal level over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years has been almost steady increases for the FBI, for the Drug Enforcement Administration, for the other parts of the Justice Department. And it really is because of those increases that we're able to do all the things that we're doing. We're not magicians, and you can't do these things without people. Obviously, you would like to have more. I would like to double or triple the number of people that I have, and I could do double or triple the number of things that I'm doing, but there are other priorities as well. I think that this is an area where we have to constantly increase manpower. I don't think that we're understaffed, but I do think this is a worthwhile area to invest more resources and more people. And I think it's an area that in the past had been shortchanged. We really do not spend a great deal of money in our society, whether it's particularly on a federal level, but it's also true on a state level, on law enforcement, and when you consider that broadly. And I think it's something we really have to look at.
Many questions involve white-collar crime and specifically the Boesky insider affair. Questioner asks, do you anticipate other major indictments, and why did Boesky seem to get such a good deal?
Okay. I imagine all of you, most of you, I'm sure, know about the Boesky case, but let me just briefly describe who don't. Ivan Boesky was a person who was involved in the securities business, in particular in the sale of bonds at the $100 million level, due to the cooperation of someone else named Dennis Levine. The federal government, the SEC, and the United States Department of Justice were able to develop 2 separate cases on him, a civil case and a criminal case. And at a very early stage, before he was arrested, before he was indicted, well before he was convicted, he decided to cooperate and agreed to settle the civil case with the SEC and to plead guilty to a federal crime carrying an exposure of 5 years in prison. And the reason why he was permitted to plead guilty to agree to plead guilty to a federal crime carrying an exposure of 5 years in prison is that at the time that he agreed to cooperate, the government was not in a position to convict him. It would have taken 1 year to 2 years to get into a position where you could have brought a case against him, which you may or may not have been able to achieve the result of convicting him, because there was only one witness. The longest sentence ever given to anyone for insider trading in this country so far is 4 years, and that was for a person who went to trial, did not cooperate, and protested his innocence when in fact a jury found him guilty. So 5 years seemed like an adequate range of sentencing for a judge. It was 1 year more than anyone has ever received for insider trading in a situation where that person didn't cooperate. And the fruits of what Mr. Boesky had to offer, insofar as numerous other people who were involved in, and institutions involved in similar activities, was something that would not have been available for 1 year or 2 years, if at all, because you might not have convicted him. And at the same time, a lot of that would have evaporated if you had let 1 year or 2 go by and go through a public trial. So from the point of view of the Department of Justice, the criminal conviction of 5 years appeared like not really a good deal for Boesky, but a good deal for the government. And insofar as the SEC's settlement with him, which there's been a great deal of public misunderstanding, that's something that I think I have to let them explain in due course, because as the facts of the Boesky case come out, much of the hysteria about his making a tremendous amount of money and being able to realize and keep a tremendous amount of money will prove to not be true, because that just isn't the case. And the decisions that had to be made by the chairman of the SEC and the SEC were very difficult decisions that involved other institutions that had invested with Boesky that were in jeopardy of going into bankruptcy, and even some serious effects on our economy if they did not work out an orderly sale of a lot of the property and bonds that Boesky had acquired for others. But that part of it I'm not an expert on, and I can't really describe to you in detail. As to the criminal conviction of Boesky, in my view, it was an extraordinarily good result for the government to get a criminal conviction of him, expose him to more time than anyone has ever received, and at the same time get his full and complete cooperation, and for a certain period of time secret, so that things could be developed that will come to fruition within the next 4 to 6 to 8 months.
The next questioner obviously is concerned personally. The question is, aren't we all guilty of some law, even though we don't know really what it is? And placing a friendly bet, for example, on the Super Bowl game might constitute racketeering activity under RICO. How do we get out of this mess?
Well, somebody must have looked at the cable traffic that passes between United States attorneys' offices, because the United States attorney in Denver, Colorado, sent me and the United States attorney in Brooklyn a challenge to bet a Coors beer on the result, on a case of Coors beer on the result of the Super Bowl, whether the Giants or, which I consider to be the New York Giants, by the way, not like our mayor. And I have always. I've been a Giant fan for 42 years, so I'm not a new Giant fan. It is gambling, I guess, is an area that is very, very difficult to deal with, because socially so many people have their own private ways of gambling, and that really isn't a concern of government or of law enforcement. And the concern with gambling are the organized gambling and the way in which it really acts, or it used to act before drugs, and before drugs became such a profitable enterprise, as the major flow of money to organized crime. I can remember investigating organized crime groups where the dollars that were being made off the numbers rackets during the day or on football betting were that night turned around and invested in buying heroin. And it was just very hard to get people to understand that when you place a friendly bet with the local bookmaker, that money a day later or 2 days later is going to be used for a purpose that you probably didn't intend. But it's an important thing for people to know.
A very specific question next. What is the current status of the Donovan case?
Well, that case in my office, that case is being prosecuted by the district attorney in Bronx County, which is one of the 5 counties in New York City. And as far as I know, the status of it is that it's on trial, and has been on trial for about 2 months, and probably is going to be on trial for another couple of months.
We certainly thank you, Mr. Giuliani, for being with us today, and we just want to give you one more question. What public office do you plan to fill next?
Almost anything I say now would get me into terrible trouble, but I have a few wisecracks that I could think of immediately. I'm very happy with the public office that I presently fill. It's very exciting and it's very challenging, and I work with terrific people. And the way I've always looked at things, and it's very hard to get people to believe this, because they think, well, there must be some private plan that you have written in your pocket, and you're doing this or that for this reason or that reason. This is a very exciting job. If you do it well and you end up leaving it with a good reputation, then if you want to seek another government office, run for it, or be appointed to it, you're going to be in good position to obtain it. And if you do a bad job, well, then you sort of stay home and read about it in the newspapers. And I don't think it's particularly helpful to have, when you're in one job, to be planning to do another, because I think you distract yourself from doing the job in front of you effectively. At some point after I leave my job, and I'm not even sure when that will be, I'm sure I'm going to want to be involved in public service again, because I find it exciting and I find it interesting and I find it exhilarating. But I can't tell you what that is or what it might be or whether anybody's going to want me. So I've enjoyed this very much. It's been a very, very interesting day. Thank you.